Hello everybody, this is Mr. Rader. This video is for students taking economics, looking at day 7 in Unit 2. This is the first video of a 2-video series looking at the impact on governmental subsidies and how they can influence supply and demand of goods and services in the marketplace. In this first video, we'll take a look at the introduction and model part of the lesson, which looks at how subsidies affect supply and demand curves. And then in the second video, we'll look at the resource on solar subsidies, and we'll look specifically at the consequences of subsidies in that particular industry. So in the introduction and model part of the lesson, first thing that you should consider is the incentives and motivations. So what incentive might the government have for spending taxpayer money to subsidize goods and services? And under what conditions might subsidies be warranted? So a good way to think about this is to consider what kinds of programs or things should the government find to be important or to place a value on it, and then to consider how that value can be reflected in the budget in terms of what programs get funded and what programs do not get funded. So while the second video speaks more to solar subsidies, for example, just for this introduction model part of the lesson, if we're thinking about, say, solar technology, or if we're looking at electric vehicle industry, so EVs, so the government used to have subsidies for Tesla cars specifically, and they still have subsidies for certain electric vehicles. And the question becomes, well, why is the government subsidizing this? Well, on the one hand, if the cars are too expensive for the average consumer to purchase, a subsidy may make it more affordable for a consumer who wants to lower their carbon footprint and to be able to drive an electric vehicle, electric car. So that's just one example. There are plenty of others. But what we want to really think about specifically here is what's going to actually happen to supply and demand when these subsidies causes a line to shift. So you might want to take a moment and just think about which line do you think is going to shift, supply or demand? And then consider how that might be reflected in the market equilibrium. And I'll show you the answer momentarily. And some things that you'll likely discuss with your teacher is to really consider, like, why are subsidies ultimately going to shift the supply curve and not necessarily the demand curve? What is the free market price of the good or service before the subsidy and after the subsidy? And how does it then affect the equilibrium price? So if we look at this source on price ceilings and pizza pies, we can see the graph where we see an original price point of $10, an original quantity of 100, and we can see the original demand curve and the original supply curve illustrated by the S. And we can see exactly where the supply and demand curves intersect as our equilibrium point. And then when we see the subsidy being placed in, the supply curve actually shifts to the right. So you'll notice really two consequences of that. So if we look at the original supply curve for the new quantity Q2 demanded, which is now 125, at a higher price point, we would see the connection on the original supply curve. Notice that the new price point, where we see the new equilibrium, actually goes down from $10 to $5. So in the reading, we can see that, if prices in the city were set to market equilibrium and we were trying to encourage the purchase and sale of pizza, the city council provides a $10 per slice subsidy to pizzerias. It wouldn't be the case that buyers get free pizza, right? It's not that there's a subsidy and that, automatically there's no price now. But what we would see, right, the P1 subsidy, supply curve shifts down, so we now have a subsidy on the supply by that subsidy amount, right? So we can see the two changes that are going to result is an increased quantity of pizza sold, right? So Q2, so more pizzas being sold at a lower price, right? So in the end of the day, the customer is paying less and the producer is able to sell more, right? So we do see a new market equilibrium, right? So we see that it's at a lower price point because there's a new supply curve, right? As opposed to the original price point 1. So that's really where we're seeing the change. And we also see, because the supply curve shifted right, that there's now more quantity that is actually being supplied, right? So there now is a demand for 125 slices as opposed to a demand, right, for only 100 slices at the equilibrium point. So we're able to supply more pizza. All right, stay tuned for part 2 of this video series where we'll look at solar subsidies and things to consider as it relates to how subsidies can influence supply and demand of goods, of services in the marketplace. Have a great day, everybody.